The most dangerous shinobi in Konoha's history were never the ones whose names appeared in the history books. They were the ones whose names were erased from them. Throughout Naruto, viewers spend most of their time following heroes who wear their identities proudly. Naruto wants the entire world to know who he is. Sasuke carries the weight of the Uchiha name everywhere he goes. Even legendary shinobi, such as Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Minato, become symbols whose reputations spread across nations. The Anbu existed for the opposite purpose. Their greatest victories could never be celebrated. Their most important missions could never be discussed. Their sacrifices could never be acknowledged. The moment they put on a mask, they ceased to exist as individuals and became tools of the village. To most citizens of Konoha, the Anbu were little more than rumors. Sometimes a masked figure could be seen standing on a rooftop before vanishing into the darkness. Sometimes whispers circulated about assassinations, disappearances, or covert operations that officially never happened. Most people understood only one thing. If the Anbu had been sent, something serious was taking place. And that was exactly how the village wanted it. The story of the Anbu is not simply a story about elite soldiers. It is a story about secrecy, sacrifice, and the hidden costs of peace. While generations of shinobi dreamed of protecting their loved ones, the Anbu were forced to protect an entire village by operating in ways that often contradicted everything those loved ones believed was right. The irony is that many of Konoha's darkest moments were prevented by people who would never receive credit for stopping them. Assassinations were halted. Foreign spies were eliminated. Political threats were neutralized. Potential wars were prevented before they could begin. Yet the men and women responsible for these victories returned home, carrying burdens they could never share with anyone. Over time, the masks became more than equipment. They became barriers. Barriers between missions and emotions. Barriers between duty and identity. Barriers between who a shinobi truly was and who the village required them to become. No character embodies this conflict more clearly than Kakashi Hatake. When most viewers think of Kakashi, they picture the calm and intelligent Jonin who guided Team 7. They remember the teacher who valued teamwork above all else and constantly preached the importance of protecting comrades. What many forget is that there was a period of his life when Kakashi barely resembled that person. There was a time when grief consumed him so completely that even the people closest to him struggled to recognize him. A time when every mission became an excuse to avoid confronting his own pain. A time when the Anbu mask slowly became easier to wear than his own face. He was not alone. Throughout Konoha's history, countless shinobi entered the Anbu carrying wounds they believed they could bury through service. Some had lost friends. Some had lost family. Some had seen things during war that never left their minds. The organization offered purpose, structure, and direction. But it also demanded something in return. The village needed warriors, willing to operate in moral gray areas. It needed people capable of doing things ordinary shinobi could not. It needed individuals willing to become shadows. And shadows, by their nature, are often forgotten. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the story of Itachi Uchiha. Before he became one of the most infamous figures in Naruto, Itachi served as one of the youngest Anbu captains in Konoha's history. While still carrying the expectations of his clan, he found himself pulled deeper into a world of espionage, surveillance, and political manipulation. Every mission pushed him further into an impossible position where loyalty to his family and loyalty to his village seemed increasingly incompatible. The tragedy that followed would permanently change the course of Naruto's world. Yet even Itachi's story cannot be fully understood without examining another force lurking behind the Anbu's history. Danzo Shimura. If the Anbu represented the hidden blade of the village, Danzo believed that blade was still too restrained. He believed true security required even greater sacrifice, even greater secrecy, and even greater control. Under his influence, an entirely different organization emerged from the shadows. An organization where names, emotions, and personal bonds were treated as weaknesses. An organization where children were taught to suppress individuality before it had a chance to develop. An organization that would eventually produce some of the most psychologically damaged shinobi in the entire series. To understand the Anbu is to understand all of these stories. It is to understand why Tobirama Senju believed Konoha needed warriors who operated outside the public eye. It is to understand how a tool created for protection slowly became intertwined with political paranoia. It is to understand why some of the village's greatest heroes spent portions of their lives hidden behind porcelain masks. Most importantly, it is to understand the cost. Because every village wants peace. Every village wants security. Every village wants someone standing between its citizens and the dangers lurking beyond its borders. The question is, who pays the price for that safety? In Konoha, the answer was often the same. Somewhere high above the village streets, hidden among the rooftops and darkness, a masked shinobi stood watch while everyone else slept. Their name remained unknown. Their accomplishments remained classified. Their sacrifices remained invisible. And that was precisely the point. The Anbu were never meant to be remembered. They were created so that everyone else could forget there was ever anything to fear. The Anbu were not created during a time of peace. They were created because peace itself was fragile. One of the biggest misconceptions about the early history of Konoha is the idea that the village's founding immediately solved the problems that had plagued the Warring States era. The alliance between the Senju and Uchiha was certainly historic. And for the first time in generations, children no longer had to grow up expecting to die on battlefields before reaching adulthood. Compared to the chaos that came before it, Konoha represented a remarkable achievement. But from Tobirama Senju's perspective, peace was not a permanent victory. It was a temporary condition that required constant protection. This belief shaped nearly every political decision he made throughout his life. Where Hashirama often focused on ideals, trust, and cooperation. Tobirama focused on systems. He understood that good intentions alone could not protect a village surrounded by rivals. Every neighboring nation wanted power. Every major village possessed talented shinobi. Every alliance carried the possibility of future betrayal. The world remained dangerous, even if people wanted to believe otherwise. Tobirama had spent his entire childhood watching family members die. Like most shinobi of his generation, he did not learn about war through stories. He learned through funerals. He watched brothers, cousins, and friends disappear long before reaching adulthood. He witnessed firsthand how quickly stability could collapse when enemies struck unexpectedly. Those experiences shaped the way he viewed leadership. Unlike Hashirama, who believed people could often be persuaded toward peace, Tobirama believed leaders had a responsibility to prepare for the moments when peace failed. And eventually, he realized that traditional shinobi forces were not enough. A village could maintain military units. A village could train jonin and chunin. A village could build defensive systems and intelligence networks. But some threats required something different. Some threats emerged long before armies gathered on battlefields. Some threats hid within political movements, espionage operations, assassination attempts, and covert conspiracies. By the time many of these dangers became visible, it was already too late to stop them through conventional means. Tobirama needed people who could operate before a crisis reached that stage. He needed shinobi capable of working in complete secrecy. He needed a force that could gather intelligence, eliminate threats, and protect the village without drawing attention to itself. The result was the Anbu. In many ways, the organization represented a natural extension of Tobirama's worldview. While ordinary shinobi defended Konoha openly, the Anbu would defend it from the shadows. They would become the village's invisible shield, operating beyond public recognition and often beyond public knowledge. The average citizen was never supposed to understand everything the Anbu did. In fact, that secrecy was part of their effectiveness. A successful Anbu mission often meant nobody realized a threat had existed in the first place. A spy disappeared before sensitive information could be stolen. An assassination plot ended before the target even knew they were in danger. A hostile nation lost an intelligence network without understanding how it had been exposed. The village remained safe precisely because the public never saw how close danger had come. This philosophy differed significantly from the heroic image many people associate with shinobi. Most young ninja entered the academy dreaming about becoming respected warriors. They imagined protecting comrades, earning recognition, and building reputations that would be remembered for generations. The Anbu offered none of those rewards. Success meant anonymity. Recognition meant remaining classified. The greatest accomplishments often disappeared into sealed reports hidden inside government archives. For Tobirama, however, this sacrifice was necessary. He understood that every nation possessed secrets. Every leader made decisions hidden from the public eye. Every village maintained operations that could not withstand public scrutiny. If Konoha wanted to survive, it needed its own specialists capable of navigating that reality. What makes Tobirama's decision particularly fascinating is that it reveals how differently he viewed the world compared to Hashirama. Hashirama dreamed of ending conflict entirely. Tobirama assumed conflict would always exist in some form. Neither man was entirely wrong. Hashirama's optimism helped create Konoha in the first place. Without his willingness to trust former enemies, the village might never have existed. Yet Tobirama recognized that idealism alone could not guarantee survival. The moment Konoha lowered its guard, another village might take advantage of that weakness. In many ways, the Anbu became the compromise between those two philosophies. The village could publicly stand for peace while privately preparing for war. It could promote cooperation while maintaining intelligence networks. It could present a hopeful face to the world while quietly dealing with threats behind the scenes. The system worked remarkably well. Over time, the Anbu became one of the most respected organizations in the shinobi world. Membership signaled extraordinary skill, discipline, and reliability. Only the most capable shinobi were considered for recruitment. The organization developed a reputation for efficiency and professionalism that extended far beyond the borders of the Land of Fire. Yet embedded within the system was a problem Tobirama may not have fully anticipated. The very qualities that made the Anbu effective also made them vulnerable. Secrecy creates distance. Distance creates isolation. Isolation creates opportunities for manipulation. When shinobi spend years operating in environments where information is restricted, emotions are suppressed, and missions take priority over personal relationships. The line between service and sacrifice can begin to blur. At first, this issue remained largely hidden. The early Anbu functioned as Tobirama intended. They protected the village. They gathered intelligence. They neutralized threats. Most importantly, they helped preserve the stability that Konoha desperately needed during its formative years. But institutions rarely remain unchanged forever. As generations passed, different leaders inherited the systems Tobirama created. Some respected his original vision. Others interpreted it differently. New conflicts emerged. Political tensions increased. Wars reshaped priorities. Gradually, the organization began evolving. The tools designed to protect the village would eventually be used for purposes Tobirama never intended. The secrecy that shielded Konoha from enemies would also shield questionable decisions from scrutiny. The anonymity that protected agents would sometimes erase parts of their humanity. And the shadow army created to preserve peace would eventually produce some of the most tragic stories in Naruto's history. Because while Tobirama succeeded in building an organization capable of defending Konoha from dangers lurking beyond its walls, he could never fully solve a far more difficult problem. What happens to the people who spend their lives living in those shadows? That question would define the next generation of Anbu, transforming an elite military force into something far more complicated than even its creator could have imagined. As the Anbu grew into one of Konoha's most important organizations, a difficult reality began emerging beneath the surface. Creating a shadow army was one thing. Maintaining one was something entirely different. Tobirama had designed the Anbu as a practical solution to practical problems. The village needed intelligence gathering. It needed counter-espionage. It needed elite operatives capable of handling threats that ordinary shinobi were never meant to confront. On paper, the system worked exactly as intended. In reality, however, the system required something that no military structure could easily provide. It required people willing to carry burdens that would remain invisible for the rest of their lives. One of the reasons the Anbu became so effective was that they operated outside the normal expectations placed upon shinobi. A jonin leading a team might spend years building trust with students and comrades. A respected clan member could take pride in family traditions and personal achievements. Even frontline soldiers received recognition for major victories. The Anbu existed in a completely different world. Their greatest successes often resulted in nobody knowing they had acted at all. Imagine preventing a war before it begins. Imagine uncovering a spy network that could have compromised village security. Imagine stopping an assassination that would have destabilized an entire nation. Now imagine never being allowed to speak about it. No celebration, no acknowledgement, no public gratitude, only another classified report and another mission waiting tomorrow. Over time, this became one of the defining characteristics of Anbu service. Members were expected to place the village above personal recognition. The mission mattered more than the individual carrying it out. While this philosophy created extraordinary discipline, it also created an environment where personal identity gradually became less important than organizational function. For many shinobi, that transition was surprisingly difficult. Human beings naturally seek meaning in what they do. They want their sacrifices to matter. They want their struggles to be understood. They want the people around them to recognize the weight they carry. The Anbu structure often denied those needs entirely. A successful operative was expected to complete missions, remain silent, and move on to the next assignment. The emotional consequences rarely entered the conversation. This became especially dangerous because Anbu missions were rarely ordinary. These shinobi were not sent to escort merchants or complete routine patrols. They were assigned tasks considered too sensitive, too dangerous, or too politically complicated for conventional forces. They witnessed situations most villagers would never even hear about. They operated in environments where hesitation could have catastrophic consequences. The psychological pressure accumulated slowly. One difficult mission became several. Several became dozens. Years passed. Experiences piled upon one another. And because discussing those experiences often violated security protocols, many Anbu agents learned to process them alone. The village benefited enormously from their sacrifices. The individuals making those sacrifices often paid the price personally. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Anbu is that membership was viewed as an honor by almost everyone outside the organization. Young shinobi looked at masked operatives with admiration. The position represented prestige, skill, and trust from the highest levels of leadership. Being selected meant the village considered you among its finest warriors. What outsiders rarely saw was the isolation that accompanied that honor. Anbu operatives frequently disappeared for extended periods. Relationships became difficult to maintain. Friendships often weakened. Even family members sometimes knew very little about the work being performed. The result was a strange contradiction. The shinobi, trusted with protecting the village, often found themselves increasingly disconnected from the people they were protecting. This disconnect would become even more significant as Konoha entered periods of political instability. Because the Anbu were never merely soldiers. They were instruments of leadership. Every Hokage inherited the organization and decided how it would be used. Some viewed the Anbu primarily as guardians. Others viewed them as intelligence assets. Some leaders emphasized restraint. Others emphasized efficiency. As priorities changed, the role of the Anbu evolved alongside them. This flexibility made the organization powerful, but it also introduced risks. A system built around secrecy inevitably depends on the integrity of the people directing it. When leadership acts wisely, secrecy protects the village. When leadership makes questionable decisions, secrecy can protect those decisions as well. The distinction is critically important. Tobirama envisioned the Anbu as a shield. Future generations would sometimes treat it as a weapon. That shift did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually through wars, political conflicts, and growing concerns about security. Each crisis encouraged leaders to expand what the organization could do. Each threat justified greater secrecy. Each emergency made extraordinary measures feel increasingly reasonable. From the perspective of village leadership, these changes often seemed necessary. The shinobi world remained dangerous. The first great ninja war was followed by another, then another, then another. Every generation faced new enemies and new uncertainties. The pressure to maintain security never disappeared. As a result, the Anbu became increasingly intertwined with the hidden machinery of government itself. They gathered intelligence on foreign nations. They monitored internal threats. They carried out missions whose details never reached the public. The organization gradually transformed into something far larger than a simple elite military unit. It became one of the pillars supporting Konoha's stability. Yet stability always carries a cost. The safer the village became, the easier it was for ordinary citizens to forget the dangers lurking beneath the surface. Children played in the streets. Shopkeepers opened their businesses. Families lived their lives, believing the village was secure. Behind that security stood countless unnamed operatives working in silence. Many would never receive recognition. Some would never fully recover from what they experienced. Others would spend years convincing themselves that sacrificing pieces of their own identity was simply part of the job. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The Anbu were created to protect the future of Konoha. They succeeded so thoroughly that most people never realized protection was happening in the first place. The organization became a victim of its own effectiveness, disappearing into the background of village life while carrying responsibilities few others could understand. As time passed, another transformation began occurring within the organization itself. The masks, originally intended as practical tools for anonymity, slowly became something much more significant. They stopped being equipment and started becoming symbols. Symbols of secrecy, symbols of sacrifice, symbols of a life where personal identity mattered less and less with every mission completed. And nowhere would that transformation become more visible than in the next generation of Anbu operatives, whose masks would eventually hide far more than their faces. They would hide grief, trauma, guilt, and loneliness, revealing a darker side of the organization that Tobirama never intended, but could never completely prevent. The mask was never just a mask. At least, it did not remain one for very long. When most people think about the Anbu uniform, the first image that comes to mind is the porcelain mask. It is one of the most recognizable symbols in Naruto. Whether shaped like a fox, a cat, a bird, or another animal, the mask immediately communicates authority, mystery, and danger. It transforms an ordinary shinobi into something larger than themselves. To the outside world, it creates an aura of professionalism and secrecy that perfectly reflects the role of the organization. But the real purpose of the mask was never intimidation. Its true purpose was anonymity. The moment a shinobi entered the Anbu, parts of their previous life began fading into the background. Their clan mattered less. Their reputation mattered less. Their personal ambitions mattered less. The village no longer needed them as an individual with unique hopes and fears. It needed them as an operative capable of carrying out missions without hesitation. On paper, this made perfect sense. The fewer people knew about an agent's identity, the safer both the operative and the village would be. Enemies could not target families if they did not know who those families were. Political rivals could not exploit relationships they could not identify. Sensitive missions remained protected because those carrying them out existed behind layers of secrecy. From a tactical perspective, the system was extremely effective. From a psychological perspective, the consequences were far more complicated. Human beings build their identities through connection. Family names, friendships, achievements, memories, and personal experiences all contribute to the understanding of who we are. Throughout Naruto, one of the most recurring themes is the importance of bonds. Naruto himself spends the entire series proving that relationships give people strength. Time and time again, the story argues that meaningful connections help individuals endure suffering and overcome despair. The Anbu operated according to a very different philosophy. Rather than strengthening bonds, the organization often required distance from them. Rather than encouraging emotional expression, it rewarded emotional control. Rather than emphasizing individuality, it prioritized function. The longer a shinobi served, the easier it became to think of themselves as a tool rather than a person. This transformation rarely happened overnight. Most recruits entered the Anbu with a strong sense of self. They still had friends, mentors, and goals. They still viewed their service as something temporary or manageable. They believed they could perform difficult missions while preserving the person they had always been. Over time, however, the demands of the job began changing that perspective. Every classified mission created another experience that could not be shared. Every covert operation added another memory that had to remain buried. Every morally complicated assignment introduced another burden that could only be carried alone. Gradually, a wall began forming between the operative and the rest of the world. The tragedy was that many shinobi did not even realize it was happening. One of the most fascinating details about the Anbu is how little the average villager understood about their daily lives. Citizens saw masked figures on rooftops and assumed they were simply elite soldiers. They imagined highly skilled warriors carrying out dangerous missions for the good of the village. That assumption was not entirely wrong. What it failed to account for was the emotional cost of living behind that image year after year. Unlike ordinary shinobi, Anbu operatives could not easily separate their professional and personal identities. The secrecy surrounding their work followed them everywhere. Conversations became limited. Relationships became more complicated. Even moments of rest were often interrupted by the knowledge that another mission could arrive at any time. For some individuals, this pressure remained manageable. For others, it slowly consumed them. The mask became a symbol of that transformation because it offered something strangely comforting. Behind the porcelain surface, a shinobi no longer had to reveal uncertainty, grief, fear, or vulnerability. The mask concealed all of it. During missions, that emotional distance could be incredibly useful. Hesitation disappeared. Doubt became easier to suppress. Difficult decisions felt simpler when viewed through the lens of duty rather than personal conscience. The danger emerged when that emotional separation stopped being limited to missions. Some operatives became so accustomed to hiding their true selves that they struggled to reconnect with them afterward. The mask protected them from pain. It also protected them from healing. This pattern became increasingly common during periods of conflict. Every major war produced new generations of shinobi carrying trauma that had never been fully processed. Many of those individuals eventually entered organizations like the Anbu because they appeared uniquely qualified for the work. Experienced soldiers understood violence. They understood sacrifice. They understood the harsh realities that ordinary citizens rarely encountered. What nobody asked was whether understanding those realities made someone suitable for a lifetime spent confronting them. In many cases, the answer was no. Some shinobi entered the Anbu precisely because they were already struggling. The organization offered structure, purpose, and a distraction from painful memories. As long as missions continued, there was little time to dwell on loss. As long as objectives remained clear, there was little need to confront complicated emotions. The problem was that grief ignored schedules. Pain ignored ranks. Trauma ignored mission reports. No matter how deeply someone buried those experiences, they remained present beneath the surface. Eventually, they demanded attention. This reality explains why so many of the most emotionally damaged characters in Naruto have connections to organizations operating in secrecy. Isolation rarely heals psychological wounds. More often, it allows them to grow unnoticed. Without trusted relationships capable of challenging unhealthy thought patterns, individuals can become trapped inside their own suffering. The Anbu did not create those wounds. What it often did was provide a place where they could remain hidden. As the years passed, entire generations of operatives learned to equate emotional detachment with professionalism. The less they felt, the more effective they believed they became. The more distant they grew, the easier difficult missions appeared. The system rewarded results, and results often came from individuals willing to suppress parts of themselves. Others would consider essential. Yet the human mind was never designed to function indefinitely under those conditions. Sooner or later, every operative faced the same question. How much of yourself can you give away before there is nothing left to return to? For most Anbu members, that question remained theoretical. For one young prodigy, named Kakashi Hatake, it would become painfully real. Because the next generation of Anbu would not merely struggle with identity. One of its most talented members would enter the organization carrying enough grief to break most people. And the shadows waiting for him inside the Anbu would nearly finish what tragedy had already started. By the time a shinobi spent several years inside the Anbu, the mask often stopped feeling like something they wore. It started feeling like who they were. This was the hidden danger that few people inside Konoha ever discussed. The Anbu's greatest strength was its ability to transform talented individuals into highly efficient operatives capable of handling missions that ordinary shinobi could never perform. Yet the very process that made those operatives effective often came at a tremendous personal cost. The village needed people who could suppress emotion, maintain secrecy, and place duty above personal desires. Over time, many Anbu members became so accustomed to living that way that they struggled to remember how to function differently. The problem was not simply that they hid their identities from others. The problem was that they slowly began hiding their identities from themselves. A shinobi's sense of self is normally reinforced through everyday life. Friends remind them who they are. Family reminds them where they came from. Teammates help them process failures and celebrate successes. Even simple interactions contribute to a person's understanding of themselves. The Anbu existed outside much of that structure. Operatives disappeared for missions without warning. Information remained compartmentalized. Conversations about work were restricted. Emotional vulnerability was rarely encouraged. The result was an environment where isolation became normal rather than exceptional. At first, many shinobi adapted successfully. The missions were important. The responsibilities felt meaningful. Being trusted with the village's most sensitive operations provided a sense of purpose that few other positions could offer. Young recruits often viewed the sacrifices as reasonable trade-offs. If protecting Konoha required a degree of personal hardship, then so be it. The difficulty emerged years later. Human beings can endure remarkable amounts of stress when they believe it is temporary. They can push through exhaustion, grief, and loneliness if they know relief is eventually coming. What becomes much harder is maintaining that same resilience when the hardship itself becomes a permanent way of life. Many Anbu operatives never experienced a clear ending point. One mission led to another. One assignment became dozens. Months became years. The habits developed for survival gradually became part of their personalities. The emotional walls built to maintain professionalism stopped coming down when missions ended. Operatives learned how to suppress fear, anger, sadness, and guilt because those emotions could interfere with performance. The trouble was that emotions do not simply disappear because they are ignored. They accumulate beneath the surface, growing heavier with each experience left unprocessed. This reality helps explain why some of the most psychologically complex characters in Naruto spent time within organizations that emphasized secrecy and emotional restraint. The series repeatedly shows that unresolved pain rarely vanishes on its own. It lingers. It changes shape. It influences decisions in ways people often fail to recognize until much later. The Anbu unintentionally created an environment where that process could accelerate. Every difficult mission carried emotional consequences. Every loss carried emotional consequences. Every morally ambiguous order carried emotional consequences. Yet the culture of the organization encouraged members to keep moving forward rather than stopping to confront those experiences directly. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this system was how reasonable it appeared from the outside. Villages at war could not afford constant hesitation. Leaders needed reliable operatives capable of acting under pressure. Intelligence gathering, counter-espionage, assassination prevention, and covert operations all required extraordinary discipline. The demands placed upon Anbu members were not arbitrary. They existed because the shinobi world itself was dangerous. The system solved practical problems. What it did not solve were human ones. Over time, some operatives became trapped between two identities. One identity belonged to the village's elite protector, the highly capable shinobi who could accomplish impossible missions without complaint. The other identity belonged to the individual hidden beneath the mask, carrying fears, regrets, and emotional wounds that never completely healed. The longer someone remained inside the organization, the wider that gap could become. For a fortunate few, strong relationships helped bridge it. For others, the gap continued growing until they barely recognized the person they had once been. This issue became especially severe for shinobi, who entered the Anbu after experiencing major personal tragedies. Rather than helping them recover, the organization sometimes provided an opportunity to avoid recovery altogether. Missions became distractions. Duty became an excuse. Work filled every empty moment that might otherwise have been spent confronting painful emotions. From the outside, such individuals often appeared exceptionally dedicated. From the inside, many were simply running from themselves. No character demonstrates this reality more clearly than Kakashi Hatake. Before joining the Anbu, Kakashi had already experienced more loss than most shinobi would face in an entire lifetime. His father died after being rejected by the village he tried to protect. His teammate Obito sacrificed himself during a mission. Shortly afterward, Rin died as well, leaving Kakashi carrying a burden of guilt that would haunt him for years. These tragedies did not merely affect him. They fundamentally altered the way he viewed the world. By the time he entered the Anbu, Kakashi was not searching for glory, recognition, or advancement. He was searching for distance. The organization provided exactly that. It offered endless missions, constant responsibilities, and a lifestyle where emotional detachment was treated as a professional virtue rather than a warning sign. For a while, the arrangement seemed to work. Kakashi became one of Konoha's most capable Anbu operatives. His skills continued developing. His reputation grew. His missions succeeded. From the perspective of village leadership, he represented exactly what the organization was designed to produce. Yet beneath those accomplishments, something troubling was happening. The shadows were not helping him heal. They were helping him hide. And as Kakashi's time within the Anbu continued, the distinction between those two things became increasingly important. Because the next chapter of the Anbu's history would reveal what happens when a shinobi carrying unbearable grief is given endless opportunities to avoid confronting it, creating one of the darkest periods in the life of one of Naruto's most beloved characters. When most fans think of Kakashi Hatake, they picture the calm jonin who taught Team 7. They remember the laid-back teacher who constantly arrived late, read his favorite novels in public, and somehow managed to remain composed no matter how dangerous the situation became. They remember a man who valued teamwork above talent, and who repeatedly taught younger shinobi that abandoning comrades was one of the greatest mistakes a ninja could make. What many people forget is that this version of Kakashi did not always exist. The Kakashi who eventually became Naruto's mentor was forged through years of grief, isolation, and emotional exhaustion. Before he became one of the most respected shinobi in Konoha, he spent a significant portion of his life trapped inside a darkness so deep that even those closest to him struggled to reach him. To understand why his Anbu years were so destructive, it is important to understand the condition he was already in before entering the organization. Kakashi's childhood was marked by loss long before he ever put on an Anbu mask. His father, Sakumo Hatake, was one of the most respected shinobi in the village. Known as the White Fang of the Leaf, Sakumo possessed a reputation so impressive that many believed he rivaled the legendary Sannin themselves. Yet despite his accomplishments, a single decision changed everything. During a mission, Sakumo chose to save his comrades, rather than prioritize the objective. The people he protected survived. The mission failed. Instead of being celebrated for protecting lives, he was condemned. The criticism became so severe that it eventually drove him into despair, culminating in his suicide. For young Kakashi, the lesson was devastating. He concluded that emotions were dangerous. He concluded that rules mattered more than people. He concluded that personal attachments only led to suffering. These beliefs followed him for years. Then Obito entered his life. Obito challenged everything Kakashi thought he knew about being a shinobi. While Kakashi focused on rules, Obito focused on loyalty. While Kakashi emphasized efficiency, Obito emphasized compassion. The two constantly disagreed, yet those disagreements slowly began changing Kakashi's perspective. Just as he started understanding Obito's philosophy, tragedy struck. Obito was crushed during a mission and seemingly died saving Kakashi's life. The experience shattered him. Before he could fully process that loss, another disaster followed. Rin died by his own hand. Although Kakashi was manipulated into the situation and carried no true responsibility for her death, guilt rarely obeys logic. The image of Rin dying in front of him became one of the defining traumas of his life. No amount of reasoning could erase the memory. No explanation could lessen the emotional burden. Within a relatively short period of time, Kakashi lost his father, Obito, and Rin. Most adults would struggle to recover from that amount of grief. Kakashi endured it as a teenager. By the time Minato became Hokage and recommended him for Anbu service, Kakashi was already emotionally exhausted. From the outside, the decision seemed reasonable. He possessed extraordinary talent, remarkable discipline, and combat abilities that exceeded those of most shinobi his age. Internally, however, he was barely holding himself together. The Anbu provided exactly what someone in his position thought he needed. Constant work, constant missions, constant distractions. The organization gave him no shortage of objectives to focus on, and no shortage of dangers requiring immediate attention. Every assignment created another reason to avoid thinking about the people he had lost. Every mission postponed the difficult emotional work of confronting his trauma. For a time, this appeared successful. Kakashi became one of Konoha's most effective operatives. His skills continued advancing at an astonishing pace. Mission reports praised his performance. Superiors trusted him with increasingly sensitive responsibilities. To anyone examining his professional record, he looked like an ideal Anbu member. The reality was much darker. The more successful Kakashi became, the more detached he grew. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this period is how little he seemed to value his own life. Many Anbu operatives accepted dangerous missions because risk was part of the job. Kakashi often appeared indifferent to whether he survived them. He carried out assignments with incredible efficiency. But there was a growing sense that self-preservation no longer motivated him the way it motivated others. When someone loses enough people, they sometimes stop imagining a future for themselves. That mindset quietly began shaping Kakashi's behavior. The village saw a brilliant operative. What it actually had was a grieving teenager, burying himself inside work because he did not know how to live with his pain. This pattern became increasingly obvious to those who knew him best. Hiruzen Sarutobi noticed it. Minato had worried about it before his death. Even fellow shinobi recognized that something was changing. The problem was that Kakashi's suffering disguised itself as professionalism. He followed orders. He completed missions. He remained disciplined. In an organization built around emotional control, his detachment often looked like competence rather than a warning sign. That is one of the great tragedies of his Anbu years. The qualities that made him appear successful were often symptoms of the very thing destroying him. As more years passed, the line between Kakashi, the person, and Kakashi, the operative, became increasingly blurred. The mask allowed him to function. The missions gave him purpose. The structure kept him moving forward. What none of those things provided was healing. Because healing requires confronting pain rather than avoiding it. The Anbu gave Kakashi countless ways to avoid it. Eventually, however, even the shadows could not protect him forever. The village leadership began recognizing that one of their most talented shinobi was slowly disappearing behind the mask he wore. If nothing changed, Kakashi risked becoming permanently trapped in the very darkness he had spent years trying to escape. And it was during this period that another force within Konoha was becoming increasingly influential. One that believed emotional detachment was not a problem to be solved, but a weapon to be perfected. While Kakashi struggled to retain his humanity inside the Anbu, Danzo Shimura was building an organization that would push those same principles to their absolute extreme. By the time Kakashi had spent several years in the Anbu, the organization had become more than a workplace. It had become a refuge. Not a healthy refuge, but a convenient one. The Anbu gave him something that grief could not. It gave him structure. Every mission came with clear objectives, clear expectations, and clear outcomes. In a life that had been shattered by loss and uncertainty, that structure provided a sense of stability. The problem was that stability and healing are not the same thing. While Kakashi continued functioning at an extraordinarily high level, the emotional wounds he carried remained largely untouched beneath the surface. This period of his life is often overshadowed by the more recognizable version of Kakashi that appears later in Naruto. But it represents one of the most important chapters in his development. Without understanding what happened during these years, it becomes difficult to fully appreciate why he eventually became the mentor that Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura needed. The village leadership gradually began noticing changes in him. Kakashi had always been serious, even as a child. The death of his father had accelerated his maturity, and the losses of Obito and Rin had pushed him even further away from the carefree behavior normally associated with youth. Yet there was a growing difference between being serious and being emotionally absent. Many of the people around him recognized that Kakashi rarely spoke about himself anymore. He completed missions with remarkable efficiency, interacted professionally with fellow shinobi, and fulfilled every responsibility expected of him. However, there was a feeling that he was simply moving through life rather than truly participating in it. The distinction mattered. A person can appear functional while quietly falling apart. For Kakashi, the Anbu environment made that process especially difficult to recognize because emotional detachment often resembled professionalism. The ability to remain calm under pressure was valuable. The ability to suppress fear during dangerous missions was valuable. The ability to prioritize objectives over personal feelings was valuable. Everything that worried his friends also happened to make him a highly effective operative. As a result, the warning signs were easy to overlook. One of the most important figures during this period was Hiruzen Sarutobi. Unlike many others, the third Hokage understood that talent alone could not solve the problems Kakashi was facing. Hiruzen had watched generations of shinobi struggle with the consequences of war, and he understood that emotional scars often lasted far longer than physical ones. The challenge was figuring out how to help someone who had become accustomed to carrying every burden alone. Kakashi was not the type of person who openly asked for support. Years of loss had taught him to internalize pain rather than share it. He rarely discussed his feelings, rarely complained, and rarely gave others an opportunity to help. From the outside, this behavior appeared strong. In reality, it often reflected a belief that nobody could truly understand what he was experiencing. This belief is surprisingly common among people carrying significant grief. The more pain they accumulate, the more isolated they often become. Over time, Kakashi's world narrowed. Missions occupied most of his attention. Relationships became increasingly distant. The future felt less important than the next assignment. He was surviving, but survival had become his primary goal rather than living. The irony is that Obito himself would have hated seeing what Kakashi had become. Before his apparent death, Obito constantly challenged Kakashi's rigid worldview. He believed that comrades mattered more than rules, and that emotional connections were a source of strength rather than weakness. Many of the lessons Kakashi eventually taught Team 7 originated with Obito. During his Anbu years, however, those lessons remained buried beneath layers of grief and guilt. Part of Kakashi still blamed himself for what happened. Logically, he understood that circumstances beyond his control had contributed to both Obito's and Rin's deaths. Emotionally, the situation felt very different. Survivors often carry responsibility for events they could never have prevented, replaying memories endlessly while imagining alternative outcomes that never truly existed. Kakashi was no exception. The more he focused on missions, the less he had to confront those thoughts. Unfortunately, avoidance only works for so long. No amount of work can permanently suppress unresolved trauma. Eventually, it begins affecting the way a person sees themselves, the way they interact with others, and the way they imagine their future. In Kakashi's case, the effects were becoming increasingly visible to those paying close attention. This growing concern ultimately led Hiruzen to make an important decision. Rather than allowing Kakashi to remain trapped inside the Anbu indefinitely, he began searching for a way to reconnect him with the aspects of himself that had been disappearing. The answer was not another mission, another promotion, or another responsibility. The answer was people, specifically younger shinobi, who would force Kakashi to engage with life in a different way. The process would take time, and the transformation would not happen overnight. Years of grief cannot be undone through a single conversation or assignment. Yet the seeds of recovery were beginning to take root. The village was slowly realizing that one of its greatest shinobi did not need more work. He needed a reason to care about something beyond work. Looking back, this realization may have saved Kakashi's life. Had he remained in the Anbu much longer, it is entirely possible that the emotional distance separating him from the rest of the world would have become permanent. Instead, he was gradually pulled back toward the connections he had spent years avoiding. The journey was neither quick nor easy, but it eventually transformed him into someone capable of passing on the lessons he had learned through tragedy. While Kakashi was slowly beginning to emerge from the shadows, another organization, hidden within Konoha, was moving in the opposite direction. Unlike the Anbu, which still maintained some connection to the village's traditional values, this new group sought to eliminate individuality altogether. Under Danzo Shimura's leadership, loyalty would be stripped of compassion. Obedience would replace personal judgment, and an entire generation of children would be taught that emotions themselves were weaknesses to be erased. If the Anbu represented the hidden blade of Konoha, then Root represented what happened when that blade was sharpened beyond reason. Danzo Shimura spent much of his life looking at the shinobi world through a lens of fear. Unlike Hiruzen Sarutobi, who believed that trust and cooperation were essential for maintaining peace, Danzo believed that peace survived only because someone was willing to do the things others refused to do. He viewed kindness as a luxury, hesitation as a weakness, and transparency as a danger. While Hiruzen governed Konoha from the light, Danzo became convinced that true security could only be achieved through the shadows. This philosophical divide shaped nearly every major decision he made. Danzo was not a man driven by personal wealth or comfort. In his own mind, he genuinely believed he was protecting the village. That belief is important because it explains why so many of his actions became so extreme. Villains who know they are doing wrong often impose limits on themselves. Danzo rarely did. Every controversial decision could be justified if it strengthened Konoha. Every sacrifice could be defended if it reduced future risks. Every moral boundary became negotiable if crossing it increased security. Over time, this mindset led him to a dangerous conclusion. The Anbu were not enough. From Danzo's perspective, even the Anbu retained too much individuality. Operatives still formed attachments. They still possessed emotions. They still maintained personal identities outside their missions. To most people, those qualities were signs of humanity. To Danzo, they represented potential weaknesses. He wanted something different. He wanted soldiers who would obey without hesitation, question nothing, and place the mission above every personal desire. The result was Root. Officially known as the Foundation, Root operated as a secret branch of the Anbu that pushed many of the organization's principles to their absolute extreme. Where the Anbu encouraged emotional discipline, Root pursued emotional elimination. Where the Anbu emphasized loyalty, Root demanded total submission. The goal was not simply to create skilled shinobi. The goal was to create weapons that happened to look like people. Children became the foundation of this system. Danzo understood that adults arrived with established personalities, beliefs, and emotional attachments. Children were different. They could be shaped before those traits fully developed. They could be conditioned to view obedience as virtue and individuality as weakness. By controlling their environment from an early age, Root could produce operatives whose loyalty surpassed anything found in conventional military organizations. The process was devastating. Young recruits were isolated from normal relationships. Friendships were discouraged. Emotional attachments were viewed as liabilities. Personal ambitions were considered distractions. Instead of developing unique identities, children were taught to define themselves through service to the organization. In many ways, Root functioned less like a military unit and more like a system of psychological conditioning. Every aspect of a recruit's life reinforced the same message. Your emotions do not matter. Your desires do not matter. Your identity does not matter. Only the mission matters. The tragic irony is that this approach often produced exactly the results Danzo wanted. Root operatives became highly disciplined. They followed orders with extraordinary consistency. They demonstrated remarkable focus during dangerous situations. From a purely tactical perspective, the program appeared successful. What those results failed to reveal was the damage being inflicted beneath the surface. Human beings are not machines. No matter how aggressively emotions are suppressed, they do not disappear. They remain present beneath the surface, shaping thoughts and behaviors in ways that eventually become impossible to ignore. Root's recruits were taught to hide those emotions rather than understand them, creating individuals who often struggled to navigate basic human relationships. Few characters illustrate this more clearly than Sai. When viewers first meet Sai, he appears almost emotionless. He speaks bluntly, struggles to understand social cues, and seems genuinely confused by many forms of interpersonal interaction. His behavior often comes across as strange or unsettling, especially when compared to Naruto's emotional openness. Yet Sai was not born that way. He was shaped that way. Years inside Root had taught him that emotional expression served no purpose. Genuine friendships were discouraged. Vulnerability was discouraged. Even grief was treated as something to suppress rather than process. As a result, Sai entered the world possessing extraordinary technical abilities, but very little understanding of how ordinary human relationships functioned. His story reveals one of the most important truths about Root. The organization could train obedience. It could not eliminate humanity. No matter how much conditioning recruits received, traces of their emotions always remained. Memories remained. Attachments remained. Questions remained. The human need for connection proved far more resilient than Danzo wanted to believe. This reality became even more apparent through Sai's relationship with his foster brother, Shin. The two boys were raised together within Root's system and experienced many of the same hardships. Despite every effort to prevent emotional attachment, they formed a genuine bond. They cared about one another. They supported one another. They found meaning in a relationship that the organization itself would have considered a weakness. When Shin eventually died, the loss affected Sai profoundly. More importantly, it demonstrated a flaw at the center of Danzo's entire philosophy. People cannot simply choose to stop caring. They can hide their feelings. they can suppress their feelings. They can deny their feelings. But those feelings continue existing regardless. This contradiction haunted Root throughout its existence. The organization sought to erase individuality while depending upon individuals to function. It attempted to eliminate emotion while relying on emotionally complex human beings to carry out its missions. Every recruit represented proof that Danzo's vision could never be fully realized, because the qualities he considered weaknesses were inseparable from the people he was trying to control. Yet despite these flaws, Root continued operating in secrecy for years. Its influence spread through Konoha's political structure, carrying out missions that remained hidden even from many members of the village leadership. The deeper Danzo became entrenched in his ideology, the more willing he became to manipulate events from behind the scenes, believing that history would eventually justify his methods. Unfortunately, some of those methods would contribute directly to one of the greatest tragedies in Konoha's history. Because while Root was busy reshaping children into tools, tensions elsewhere in the village were rapidly escalating. Suspicion, paranoia, and political distrust were growing between Konoha's leadership and the Uchiha clan. Standing at the center of that conflict was a young Anbu captain named Itachi Uchiha, whose loyalty would soon be tested in ways that no shinobi should ever have to endure. The greatest failure of Root was not that it produced dangerous shinobi. The greatest failure of Root was that it convinced itself that humanity was a flaw that could be removed. Danzo spent years trying to create the perfect operatives. He wanted shinobi who would never hesitate, never question orders, and never place personal feelings above the interests of the village. From a strategic standpoint, the goal seemed logical. Emotional attachments had complicated missions throughout history. Fear caused mistakes. Grief impaired judgment. Personal loyalties could conflict with organizational objectives. If those factors could somehow be eliminated, Danzo believed he could create a force more effective than any army Konoha had ever possessed. What he failed to understand was that the same emotions he viewed as weaknesses were often the very qualities that made people worth protecting in the first place. This contradiction became increasingly visible as Root expanded. The organization produced capable operatives, but many of them struggled to function outside the environment that had created them. They understood orders, procedures, and mission objectives. They understood discipline and sacrifice. What many of them struggled to understand were ordinary human experiences, such as trust, friendship, affection, and belonging. These were not accidental side effects. They were the direct result of Danzo's philosophy. Root recruits were taught that emotional connections created vulnerabilities. If a shinobi cared deeply about another person, that relationship could be exploited by enemies. If a shinobi formed attachments, they might hesitate during critical moments. If personal feelings influenced decision-making, mission success could be placed at risk. Over time, recruits learned to suppress those instincts. The problem was that suppression is not the same thing as elimination. No matter how aggressively Danzo tried to erase individuality, traces of it always survived. Human beings naturally seek meaning through connection. They seek companionship. They seek understanding. They seek people who make life feel less lonely. These impulses cannot simply be trained away because they exist at a fundamental level of human psychology. The relationship between Sai and Shin demonstrated this reality perfectly. Both boys were raised within Root's system. Both received the same conditioning. Both were taught the same lessons about emotional detachment and obedience. Yet despite every effort to prevent it, they developed a genuine bond. They became brothers in every meaningful sense of the word. That bond represented something Danzo could never fully control. It represented humanity asserting itself against conditioning. Even after Shin's death, the impact of that relationship remained. The grief Sai carried proved that emotions had never truly disappeared. They had simply been buried beneath years of training and expectations. The pain he experienced became evidence that the system itself had failed to accomplish its primary objective. Ironically, the more Root attempted to remove human emotion, the more obvious its importance became. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the organization's history. Operatives continued forming attachments. They continued developing personal values. They continued struggling with moral questions that could not be solved through simple obedience. Danzo could influence behavior, but he could not completely rewrite human nature. Yet instead of reconsidering his methods, he doubled down on them. One of Danzo's defining traits throughout Naruto is his inability to recognize the limits of his own worldview. He consistently interprets setbacks as evidence that he has not gone far enough, rather than evidence that his approach might be flawed. Every failure becomes justification for more control. Every complication becomes justification for more secrecy. Every threat becomes justification for more extreme measures. This mindset gradually transformed him into one of the most influential figures operating behind Konoha's political system. While Hiruzen governed openly, Danzo built networks. While Hiruzen emphasized diplomacy, Danzo prepared contingencies. While Hiruzen searched for compromise, Danzo searched for leverage. The two men wanted the same outcome, a secure and prosperous village, but they fundamentally disagreed about how that outcome should be achieved. In many ways, their conflict reflected one of the central themes running throughout Naruto. Can peace be built through trust? Or must peace ultimately be enforced through fear? Danzo never stopped believing the second answer. That belief shaped his decisions for decades, influencing events far beyond the walls of Root itself. The organization's existence allowed him to gather intelligence, manipulate political situations, and conduct operations that remained hidden from public scrutiny. With every passing year, his influence expanded further into the machinery of village leadership. The consequences would eventually reach far beyond Root. As tensions between Konoha and the Uchiha clan continued growing, Danzo saw an opportunity. Rather than viewing the situation as a political problem requiring reconciliation, he increasingly viewed it as a security threat requiring containment. The distinction was crucial because it determined the solutions he considered acceptable. Where others still hoped for peace, Danzo began preparing for conflict. Where others searched for dialogue, Danzo searched for advantages. Where others saw citizens of Konoha, Danzo increasingly saw potential enemies. This mentality would play a significant role in one of the most tragic chapters in Naruto's history. The Uchiha clan had helped found the village. Their contributions stretched back to the very beginning of Konoha itself. Yet years of suspicion, political isolation, and mutual distrust had created a situation where both sides struggled to see one another clearly. Fear began replacing understanding. Assumptions replaced communication. Every action was interpreted through the lens of potential betrayal. Caught in the middle of this growing crisis was a young prodigy carrying responsibilities far beyond his years. Itachi Uchiha was simultaneously a loyal son, a devoted brother, a member of the Uchiha clan, and one of Konoha's most talented Anbu captains. Under normal circumstances, balancing those identities would have been difficult enough. Under the conditions developing inside the village, it became nearly impossible. As the political situation deteriorated, the skills that had made Itachi valuable to the Anbu also made him uniquely vulnerable. He possessed access to information from multiple sides of the conflict. He understood the fears driving village leadership. He understood the frustrations growing within his clan. Most importantly, he understood that both sides were moving toward a confrontation that could permanently change the future of Konoha. The tragedy was that very few people appreciated the impossible position he had been placed in. Soon, the world of espionage, secrecy, and hidden loyalties that defined the Anbu would collide directly with the growing crisis surrounding the Uchiha clan. When that happened, Itachi would be forced to make decisions that no child should ever have to make. And the consequences of those decisions would echo throughout the entire Naruto story for years to come. Few shinobi in Naruto embody the tragedy of the Anbu more completely than Itachi Uchiha. Long before he became one of the most feared criminals in the shinobi world, Itachi was a child who desperately wanted peace. Unlike many prodigies whose talents isolated them from others, Itachi's intelligence gave him an unusually clear understanding of how fragile peace actually was. From a young age, he witnessed the aftermath of war and saw suffering on a scale that most children could not even comprehend. Those experiences shaped his worldview in profound ways, convincing him that conflict was rarely glorious, and that the cost of violence was almost always paid by ordinary people. This perspective made him unique among his peers. While others dreamed of becoming powerful shinobi, Itachi spent much of his youth questioning why shinobi wars continued happening at all. He understood combat. He excelled in every aspect of shinobi training. Yet beneath those accomplishments existed a deep desire to prevent the kinds of tragedies that had scarred previous generations. Unfortunately, he came of age during one of the most politically unstable periods in Konoha's history. Following the Nine-Tails attack, suspicion surrounding the Uchiha clan intensified dramatically. Although no proof existed linking the clan to the disaster, many village leaders quietly viewed the Uchiha with growing distrust. The clan itself sensed this shift. Positions of influence became more limited. Surveillance increased. Political isolation deepened. What began as unease gradually evolved into resentment on both sides. As tensions mounted, Itachi found himself standing between two worlds. On one side stood the Uchiha clan, including his parents, relatives, and the community that had raised him. On the other stood Konoha itself, the village he genuinely loved and had sworn to protect. Under normal circumstances, those loyalties would have complemented one another. The Uchiha were among Konoha's founding clans, and serving one should have meant serving the other. The tragedy was that circumstances were no longer normal. As distrust increased, the interests of the clan and the interests of village leadership began diverging. Each side grew more convinced that the other represented a threat. Each side interpreted events through the lens of fear. Every failed attempt at understanding pushed them further apart. Because of his extraordinary abilities, Itachi became deeply involved in this increasingly dangerous situation. His rapid rise through the ranks eventually led to his appointment as an Anbu captain, at an age when most shinobi were still developing basic leadership skills. Officially, this reflected the village's confidence in his talent. Unofficially, it placed him in an impossible position. The Anbu granted access to information that few people possessed. For the first time, Itachi could see the fears driving village leadership. He understood why some officials viewed the possibility of a Uchiha uprising as a catastrophic threat. He saw intelligence reports, political discussions, and security concerns that ordinary clan members never encountered. At the same time, he remained connected to the frustrations building within the Uchiha. He saw respected clan members becoming increasingly alienated from the village they had helped create. He listened to conversations filled with anger, disappointment, and suspicion. He understood why many Uchiha believed they were being treated unfairly. The more information he gained from both sides, the more obvious it became that neither side fully understood the other. This knowledge became a burden. Most people involved in the conflict viewed events from a single perspective. They had the luxury of believing their side was entirely justified. Itachi did not. He could see the fears, mistakes, and motivations driving both groups. Rather than simplifying the situation, greater understanding made it more painful. Every day brought him closer to a conclusion he desperately wanted to avoid. The village and the clan were moving toward confrontation. What made the situation especially tragic was that neither side truly wanted the outcome that seemed increasingly likely. Village leaders feared civil war. The Uchiha feared continued oppression and marginalization. Yet fear has a way of creating the very future people are trying to prevent. The more each side prepared for conflict, the more likely conflict became. Throughout this period, Itachi continued serving within the Anbu, carrying responsibilities far beyond what any teenager should have been expected to bear. The organization had always required secrecy, emotional restraint, and loyalty to the village. For Itachi, those expectations became far more complicated because the people being monitored were often members of his own clan. Every mission deepened the conflict within him. Every report forced him to confront questions with no satisfactory answers. Every conversation revealed how rapidly the situation was deteriorating. The Anbu had been created to protect Konoha from threats operating in the shadows. Now, one of its most talented captains found himself trapped in a crisis where the threat was not a foreign enemy, but a growing fracture within the village itself. As the months passed, opportunities for peaceful resolution began disappearing. Political positions hardened. Trust eroded further. The possibility of compromise grew more distant. Itachi understood better than almost anyone what a civil war would mean. He understood how many people would die. He understood how vulnerable Konoha would become to foreign enemies. Most importantly, he understood that once violence began, controlling the consequences would be impossible. The young Anbu captain found himself carrying knowledge that would break most adults. He could see disaster approaching. He could see the motivations driving it. And he could see how little time remained to stop it. Soon, the conflict between the Uchiha and Konoha would reach its breaking point. When it did, the values that had defined Itachi's entire life, his love for his family, his loyalty to the village, and his desire for peace, would collide in a way that made it impossible to preserve all three. The decision waiting for him would become one of the darkest and most controversial moments in Naruto's history, forever transforming both the Anbu and the legacy of the Uchiha clan. As the situation between the Uchiha clan and Konoha continued deteriorating, Itachi gradually came to understand a painful truth that very few people around him were willing to accept. There was no longer a solution that would leave everyone unharmed. For years, tensions had been building beneath the surface of the village. The distrust that followed the Nine-Tails attack had never fully disappeared. The Uchiha felt isolated and increasingly excluded from positions of influence. Village leadership feared that resentment within the clan was evolving into something more dangerous. Every attempt to monitor the situation seemed to generate additional suspicion rather than reassurance. By the time Itachi reached his late teenage years, discussions of a coup had moved beyond rumor. Key members of the Uchiha clan had begun considering direct action against the village leadership. From their perspective, years of discrimination and political marginalization had left them with few alternatives. They believed Konoha had betrayed one of its founding clans, and many saw resistance as the only remaining path forward. The problem was that Itachi understood the consequences far better than most of the people advocating for it. Unlike the majority of the clan, he possessed access to information from the highest levels of village leadership. He understood how seriously the threat was being taken. He understood how quickly the conflict could escalate beyond anyone's control. Most importantly, he understood that a civil war inside Konoha would not remain an internal matter for long. The five great nations existed in a constant state of cautious competition. Even during periods of relative peace, every village monitored the strengths and weaknesses of its rivals. If Konoha became consumed by internal conflict, foreign powers would almost certainly take advantage of the opportunity. What began as a dispute between the Uchiha and village leadership could easily evolve into a much larger disaster, affecting the entire Land of Fire. This realization haunted Itachi. He loved his clan. He loved his village. The tragedy of his situation was that those loyalties were no longer pointing in the same direction. Throughout Naruto, many characters face difficult choices, but few are forced to choose between two things they genuinely care about. Most conflicts involve a clear enemy or an obvious moral boundary. Itachi's situation offered neither. The people on both sides were individuals he wanted to protect. The fears driving both sides were understandable. The mistakes being made were shared rather than isolated. The more he searched for a peaceful solution, the more impossible one seemed to become. At the center of this crisis stood Danzo Shimura. While Hiruzen continued hoping for a diplomatic resolution, Danzo increasingly viewed the situation through the lens of security and risk management. To him, the possibility of an Uchiha uprising represented a threat that needed to be eliminated before it could materialize. The fact that thousands of innocent people would be affected mattered less than preventing a conflict that could destabilize the village. This difference in perspective would prove decisive. Danzo saw a problem. Itachi saw people. That distinction explains why the burden fell so heavily upon him. Unlike Danzo, Itachi understood exactly what would be lost if the situation reached its worst possible outcome. He knew the faces of the people being discussed in political meetings. He had grown up alongside them. He shared their history. He shared their blood. Every conversation about the Uchiha clan was, in a very real sense, a conversation about his own family. As the crisis reached its final stages, Itachi found himself carrying an impossible responsibility. He was expected to think like an Anbu captain, act like a loyal shinobi of Konoha, and remain connected to a clan that increasingly viewed the village as an enemy. No matter what decision he made, someone he cared about would suffer. The emotional weight of that position is difficult to overstate. At an age when most people are still discovering who they are, Itachi was being asked to help determine the future of an entire village. When the decisive moment finally arrived, he chose what he believed would save the greatest number of lives. It remains one of the most controversial decisions in anime history because it forces viewers to confront a question with no comfortable answer. If every available option leads to tragedy, how should a person choose between them? Itachi's answer was shaped by the same philosophy that had guided much of his life. He believed that his own suffering mattered less than preventing a larger catastrophe. He believed that sacrificing himself was preferable to allowing thousands of others to become casualties of war. The decision destroyed him. Although history would remember him as the man who annihilated his own clan, the reality was far more complicated. The burden of that night never left him. Every choice he made afterward was influenced by it. Every action he took as a member of the Akatsuki was shaped by it. Even his relationship with Sasuke became intertwined with the guilt, grief, and responsibility he carried for the rest of his life. In many ways, Itachi became the ultimate product of the Anbu system. He was a shinobi who placed the village above himself He was a shinobi who carried unbearable secrets in silence. He was a shinobi who accepted hatred, isolation, and condemnation because he believed doing so served a greater purpose. The tragedy is that no one should ever have been asked to bear that burden in the first place. By the end of the Uchiha crisis, the Anbu had become far more than the organization Tobirama originally envisioned. What began as a covert force designed to protect Konoha had become deeply entangled with political fear, secrecy, and decisions that would shape the lives of entire generations. Yet despite all the suffering that emerged from the shadows, the influence of the Anbu did not end with Itachi. Their legacy would continue to shape the world of Naruto long after the masks came off, affecting everything from village politics to the lives of the heroes who inherited the future. When most people think about the major forces that shaped the world of Naruto, they usually focus on the Hokage, the great clans, or the legendary shinobi, whose names became known across the 5 great nations. The Anbu rarely enter that conversation. That is fitting, because invisibility was always their purpose. The greatest irony of the organization is that many of the most important events in Naruto's history were influenced by people whose names were never celebrated. While heroes fought on battlefields and leaders stood before the public, countless Anbu operatives worked behind the scenes, preventing crises, gathering intelligence, protecting political stability, and carrying out missions that would never appear in history books. In many ways, the modern version of Konoha could not have existed without them. From Tobirama's original vision to the countless covert operations that followed, the Anbu became one of the hidden foundations upon which the village was built. They protected leaders from assassination attempts, uncovered foreign threats before they escalated into wars, and served as the village's first line of defense against dangers that ordinary citizens never even knew existed. Yet their legacy extends far beyond military success. The true story of the Anbu is ultimately a story about sacrifice. Not the kind of sacrifice that happens during a dramatic final battle, but the quieter kind that accumulates over years. The sacrifice of identity. The sacrifice of recognition. The sacrifice of emotional well-being. The sacrifice of a normal life. Characters like Kakashi and Itachi illustrate this better than anyone. Both entered the Anbu as exceptionally talented young shinobi. Both believed they were serving something greater than themselves. Both carried responsibilities far beyond what should have been expected of people their age. And both emerged from those experiences permanently changed. Kakashi spent years losing himself inside the organization before eventually rediscovering the importance of human connection. Itachi carried secrets so devastating that he willingly allowed the entire world to misunderstand him in order to protect the people he loved. Their stories are different, but they reveal the same truth. The Anbu could protect the village. They could not protect the people inside the organization from the consequences of living in the shadows. This contradiction followed the Anbu throughout their entire history. The organization was created to defend Konoha, yet some of its darkest moments emerged from the very secrecy that made it effective. Danzo's manipulation of Root, the Uchiha crisis, and countless covert political decisions all demonstrated how easily hidden power could become disconnected from accountability. The same shadows that concealed enemies could also conceal mistakes. That does not mean Tobirama's vision was wrong. The shinobi world remained dangerous throughout much of Naruto's history. Villages needed intelligence networks. Leaders needed protection. Certain threats required specialized operatives capable of working outside the public eye. The need that inspired the creation of the Anbu never truly disappeared. What changed was the understanding of what those operatives required in return. One of the quiet lessons running throughout Naruto is that strength cannot exist in isolation forever. Again and again, characters who cut themselves off from others eventually suffer because of it. Meanwhile, characters who embrace meaningful bonds often find the resilience needed to overcome extraordinary challenges. The Anbu existed in tension with that lesson. The organization demanded emotional distance, but the series repeatedly demonstrated the value of emotional connection. It demanded secrecy. While many of Naruto's greatest victories came through understanding and trust, it demanded sacrifice, yet also revealed the dangers of asking people to sacrifice too much of themselves. Perhaps that is why so many former Anbu members eventually found healing outside the organization rather than within it. Kakashi found purpose through mentoring the next generation. Yamato found belonging through teamwork and friendship. Sai gradually learned how to form genuine connections after years spent suppressing his emotions. Even Naruto himself benefited from lessons passed down by individuals whose lives had been shaped by the shadows. Their experiences became warnings as much as examples. By the end of the series, the shinobi world begins moving toward a future very different from the one Tobirama inherited. The endless cycle of war starts breaking. Villages cooperate more openly. Relationships between nations improve. While conflict never disappears entirely, the world slowly becomes less dependent on the kind of secrecy that had defined previous generations. In that sense, the Anbu occupy a fascinating place in Naruto's history. They were necessary. They were effective. They were often heroic. But they were also a product of a harsher era, an era in which survival frequently demanded sacrifices that later generations would no longer be willing to make. The masks remain one of the most iconic symbols in the franchise because they represent something larger than a military organization. They represent the hidden burden carried by those who protect others from dangers they may never see. They represent the cost of maintaining peace in an imperfect world. Most importantly, they remind us that some of the most important battles are fought far away from recognition, applause, or gratitude. The citizens of Konoha slept peacefully because someone else stayed awake. The village endured because someone else carried the burden. The heroes received the credit because someone else remained unseen. And for generations, those unseen guardians watched from the rooftops above the village, hidden behind porcelain masks, sacrificing pieces of themselves so that others would never have to know what was sacrificed on their behalf. That was the legacy of the Anbu. A legacy built in silence. A legacy built in shadow, and a legacy that shaped the world of Naruto long after the masks were gone.